My name is Lorraine Jackson, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe it's time for us to stop carrying everyone else and start protecting our peace. I waited 30 years for a single evening to be about me. No casseroles, no excuses, no emergency calls, and they turned it into a collection plate. For the first time in my life, I didn't pull out my checkbook. I tore it up instead. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to... I have a picture on my phone of a dining room table crowded with plates, laughter, and messy hands. The kind of photograph you keep because it reminds you of what you did, not what you got. My Sunday dinners used to be a rotating program. Roast chicken the week my sister had a new job interview, collard greens on my mama's birthday, lasagna when the kids had prom pictures to print. Over the years, the seating chart read like a ledger. My brother, Deacon Marcus, who couldn't seem to keep a job steady enough to finish a car note. My niece Tasha, with her expensive shoes and empty pockets. Cousins who lived under the same roof for months and never chipped in for the light bill. I always told myself it was family. I always told my church friends it was love. Before I even knew what exhaustion felt like for the soul, I was fixing refrigerators and sending wires at midnight. There was a time I could walk into my bank and the teller would smile because they recognized my routine. Transfers to Cousin Bobby's bail account, a wire to a law firm for a niece's parking ticket that mysteriously became a court date, a monthly auto pay to keep my brother's car from going to the repo lot. I had lists in the back of a drawer, credit card numbers, due dates, reminders to call anyone who needed a cosigner. I was the one people called when their lights were about to be cut. I was the one who jumped when their desperation sounded bigger than their pride. I remember the night I stayed up until 2 in the morning, helping Tasha rewrite a resume she wouldn't finish the next day. I drove down to the DMV for Marcus when he couldn't get time off, and I never counted the hours spent in waiting rooms while others counted on me. The work wasn't always financial. I patched rifts, smoothed tempers, lied to bosses so someone could stay on payroll, sat in lawyer offices while hands that should have been on a steering wheel asked me, casually, for checks. My body memorized the responsibilities my heart refused to name. It was a slow hunger that wore my edges down until I didn't know where Lorraine started and family needs ended. And still, when I booked a reservation for my anniversary, a quiet table with a white linen that wouldn't be nicked by casserole dishes, there was that small, ridiculous part of me that told myself I deserved it. I booked it in April for August, imagining a single, uninterrupted evening that had nothing to do with fixing reputations or covering bad decisions. I imagined myself in a simple dress that made me feel young for an hour, and an order of food that I didn't have to split 3 ways. But people had a way of treating your silence like permission. My silence had been a welcome mat for decades. 2 weeks before the dinner, my niece dropped by with the kind of casualness that meant another emergency. "Auntie," she said, palms full of papers, "I need help with some legal fees. Court date next month." She was looking at me like I'd been put there to fix things. I didn't say yes right away. For the first time in years, my voice sounded like gravel, rough, regretful. I wrote down the amount, went home, and instead of sending the usual wire, I put the sheet in a drawer. I told myself I'd think about it. It was the smallest rebellion, refusing to be an automatic yes. When my sister called the next afternoon to ask if I could cover Marcus's car payment, I said I couldn't. She laughed like I was joking. "Lorraine, it's you," she said. "You always come through." I listened to the sentence as if it were an accusation and let it sit on the line between us. The week of the dinner, I started checking calendars and automatic payments. I'd been set up on subscriptions and transfers that ran like machinery I had greased myself. There were payees I'd added 10 years ago who were still drawing from my account. I made a list and circled amounts with a red pen. The numbers added up to more than I wanted them to. At night, I would rehearse myself saying no without guilt. Somewhere along the way, I realized my generosity had been traded for entitlement. The person I had been protecting had learned to expect protection. On the morning of the dinner, I walked past the mirror and smoothed my hair with hands that remembered all those hospital waiting rooms. I put on a dress I hadn't worn in a decade and felt the fabric like a small reclaiming. My phone buzzed with the usual: church announcements, cousin jokes, birthday tags. The last text before I left the house said simply, "Don't spend it all, remember us." I folded the message shut and left it unread. I wanted that night to be unbothered, the way one prays for rain and gets a clear sky. When I sat down at the table, the city lights of Baltimore tilting like small promises outside the restaurant windows, I expected to breathe. I expected to let the waiter fold the napkin into my lap and not use my fingers to fix some family hole. When the candle in front of me bloomed, it felt almost sacramental. I was learning how to be an owner of my time for once. I had taken the bus home twice this summer just to be alone. I had learned that my presence did not have to be spent like currency. Then the evening opened at the restaurant door like a trap door. A chorus of voices smacked into the warmth of the dining room. It took half a second to place them. Marcus's loud laugh, Tasha's nervous clatter of jewelry, Cousin Bobby's booming hometown braggadocio. They walked up to my table with the kind of swagger someone who has been bailed out once too often carries. They didn't pause to knock, didn't ask if my plate was for me. They simply slid into my reservation like they had been there all along. I felt the air tighten. "Lawrence," Marcus said with that familiar mix of mischief and expectation. He kept calling me Lawrence instead of Lorraine, some habit. "We heard there's a party. Don't let me miss a good drink." Tasha grinned like everything was a joke. Nobody said sorry. Nobody said congratulations. They sat like they had every right to consume my evening. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice smooth. The waiter hovered, confused. This was supposed to be private. Marcus folded his arms like he was setting up camp. "Private for who? Girl, you always eat good. We came to celebrate you." His tone was slippery. Celebration was a mask. Before I could refuse, Tasha leaned over and dropped a stack of papers onto the table with practiced gravity. "Cousin James got into some trouble," she said, eyes flicking to me. "He has a court date. Lawyers. We need help with fees." She didn't ask. She laid out the need like a menu item. They talked fast, their words jostling for space like kids in a pantry. They listed amounts with the same ease I had once used to list recipes. "It's only 3,000, Bobby said. "Lore, you got it." Marcus reached for my napkin as if he were going to borrow it, then put his elbow on my chair. "Lord, you always take care of us. You did for Mama stuff, you did for this, you did for that." Their faces were expectant, their eyes glassy with entitlement. The waiter came with a pen. I watched him hand it over like some herald presenting an invitation to resume old behaviors. My hand closed around the pen. There was a small, absurd moment when I felt the weight of it, when I could imagine the ink flowing and the paper living up to all their demands. For 30 years, I had been a slow, guaranteed yes. People treated my approval like oxygen. I thought of every midnight wire, every sobbing plea that bled into my sleep. For the first time, I felt the possibility of refusing without explanation. Bobby leaned in, lowering his voice as if that made the ask more intimate. "Girl, you know how it is. We don't like to ask, but when we're down, we come to you." He said it like a benediction. Tasha started listing names, attorneys, due dates, her hair tickling my shoulder. They acted like I should be pleased to help. It was performative, their gratitude stale with ownership. I reached for the check. The pen felt heavier. The waiter handed me a nice pen, gold, balanced, a small ceremonial object. I remember looking at it and thinking, "You're so predictable, Lorraine." My fingers moved slowly. The napkin under my elbow had my name, my reservation time. I could feel the eyes of the table slicing me into expected parts. If I filled out that check, The pattern would hold for another decade. If I didn't, everything would tip. They argued, softly, accusingly, about who had the hardest life, who had the worst bills. Their voices rose and softened. Each sentence was a little rope to pull me in. "You know we wouldn't be like this," Marcus said, like a plea or a threat. The trumpet of entitlement made me remember my mother. She had taught us to feed one another, but she also taught us about dignity. Somewhere between the two lessons, my family had picked only the feeding. When I tore the paper, no one expected the method. They expected a check slid across, hands trembling with gratitude, perhaps a sermon later about closure. Instead, I put the pen down, folded the check neatly, and tore it into pieces. The motion was small, almost domestic, like tearing up a receipt you no longer needed. The pieces were so tiny they looked like confetti. I dropped them into my champagne glass. There was a tiny sound as paper hit glass, a soft rain. The waiter froze. My family blinked. "You ain't serious," Bobby said. The sentence was an accusation. He leaned forward, face flushing. "Don't you do that, Lore. We came for help." There was anger in his voice now, sharp and immediate. Marcus's jaw worked. Tasha's fingers trembled. For a second, the room felt full of everything I'd been holding in my bones. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call them names. I smiled and said, "Nope." I left the glass sitting where it was, the torn check floating like a small private fire. Then I paid for my own entree with my card, tipped the waiter, and stood up. My dress rustled against the chair as I moved. I walked out the door. Before I reached the sidewalk, Marcus shouted after me, a clumsy attempt to wrap his entitlement in religiosity. "Auntie, you gon' pray about us, right?" I didn't look back. The street swallowed the restaurant's warmth and gave me a Baltimore cold night. I felt lighter than I had in years, but the relief was threaded with guilt. In the corner of my pocket, my phone trilled with missed calls. Walking away wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, and it hurt like anything that splits you from your own history. By Sunday morning, the calls had turned voluminous. Marcus called my house phone. I let it roll to voicemail. Tasha messaged all morning, angry, then pleading, then trying to make me laugh with memes. My sister arrived at my door in the afternoon, braids pulled up, hands full of disappointment. "Lorraine," she said, breathless, "you can't do what you did." Her face was small and hard. When I explained that I needed a break, she told me I'd always be family, and family meant sacrifice. She wanted me to understand that my break was a luxury. I stood in my kitchen and watched her say the word luxury like it was a sin. That night, a letter arrived. I opened it with a trembling hand. It was a note from someone I had supported years ago, an old contractor who had never learned to manage money. He called me ungrateful, accused me of abandoning him in his time of need, and demanded repayment for all the help you've given me. The audacity was such that it looped me back to the beginning. They had been taught to take. They had never had to be taught how to stand on their own. I slept badly, which surprised me because I'd expected fear. Instead, there was a strange, calm clarity. The breaking point had been reached without drama. They had shown me who they truly were. My choice had not been to punish them in public. It was simply the refusal to keep being their fix. The silence that followed was heavy with consequences I had not actively wished for, but that I was not afraid to let unfold. I went through my files like a woman separating seeds from chaff. There were paper piles that showed a decade of invisible labor, bank transfers to people who called me auntie in passing and friend when it suited them. There were stacks of receipts from bail bonds and deposits I'd made at odd hours. I opened an older photo album, the one with my mother's handwriting on the inside cover, and let my fingers trace the margins where people wrote "Love Ma" next to their names. I realized my love had been measured in payments. I cried quietly, not the kind of dramatic weeping that calls attention, but the slow smallness that gathers inside your sternum. The next morning, I made a plan. It was procedural and almost mechanical. I called my bank, set up new passwords, canceled automatic transfers that had been in place since flip phones were fashionable. I changed phone numbers, not because I wanted to hide, but because there are times when your peace demands borders. When the bank asked if I wanted to set up fraud alerts, I said yes. When the branch manager expressed concern, I said, "This is me exercising control. No apology, no drama." I canceled the auto pay that sent 30% of my account to family expenses. I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer friend to talk about co-signature liabilities and any informal debts lodged in my name. I made a list in a little notebook of accounts to close. The act of writing felt like applying balm. I framed one of my mother's handwritten recipes and tucked it into a stack of documents as a reminder that love had once meant more than bailouts. A week later, I signed a simple document, no theatrics, just ink and a notary stamp that transferred the title of a car I'd been carrying for Marcus back into his name, along with a clear letter explaining my limits. It was a clean, dignified refusal. I sent copies to his email and left a voicemail that said nothing more than, "I have done what I can reasonably do. I will not be a perpetual guarantor." The silence that followed felt seismic. I changed my number and blocked the usual suspects, Marcus, Bobby, the cousins who treated me like a fund. The phone, when it did ring, belonged to new contacts, an overseas travel agent with cheap flights to Lisbon, a friend asking if I wanted to join a 2-week retreat in Morocco. In the quiet, my life breathed differently. I began to plan trips and small acts of tenderness for myself, little pleasures never meant to hurt anyone, only to restore me. Packing was an exercise in ritual. I folded dresses I hadn't worn in years and slid passports into a velvet pouch. I boxed up family photos that didn't support my well-being and left others in a shoebox labeled memories. I took the mail and filed letters that were demands under a folder called "To be handled" and let the rest sit. I called my credit card companies and asked for new cards with new numbers. I set up alerts so that if any of the people I had supported tried to siphon funds, I would know immediately. One calm afternoon, I went to the storage unit, where I had kept that casserole dish my mother used on holidays. I sat on the concrete floor, the metal roll-up door framing a sliver of sun, and I held the dish like it was a relic. The dish knew me. It's the little rituals, the way you wrap an heirloom, that underline a transformation. When I left, I didn't leave a note for the family. I left myself a letter, a list of places I wanted to see, meals I wanted to taste, and a promise that my presence would no longer be a free resource for bad choices. The day I canceled the automatic electricity payment I'd slipped into a landlord's account for my sister's household, I received a terse text from her. "You can't do this to us." The text was less accusation than unprocessed panic. I didn't respond. The choice to stop was not a punishment, it was preservation. I was not punishing them by refusing to finance their irresponsibility. I was protecting my life from being invisible. One morning, 2 weeks after the dinner, my mailbox held an envelope marked with the county sheriff's pre-eviction notice addressed to my sister. I didn't call her. I let the notice sit on the table like the consequence of a lesson she'd refused to learn. I had been the soft cushion for too long, and cushions wear out. Cutting myself free was like taking away the pillow that kept everyone from landing on a hard floor. When Marcus called later that afternoon and begged me to stop the car repo, I asked him quietly, "Did you not read the notices?" He stammered a string of excuses, jobs lost, but promises of repayment. I said nothing more than, "I am not able to help." My voice wasn't cold in a performance way. It was simply without the usual tremor that meant capitulation. He pleaded. I ended the call. The silence that followed felt like a hinge turning. That night I passported a new, soft life. I booked a solo trip to Lisbon with a refundable ticket and a room with a balcony. It felt decadent and necessary. I drank a glass of cheap wine and wrote down the names of streets I wanted to walk in capitals. No one needed to know. I planned with the hush of someone reclaiming the thermostat of their own heart. The last act before full separation was practical. I went to the branch, signed papers to restrict who could access my accounts, and arranged for direct deposits to go into accounts I controlled fully. I took care of Medicare, my heating bill, and a small automatic transfer to a savings account labeled trips. When the banker nodded in approval, there was a quiet satisfaction that felt almost pious. I had done the adult thing I had avoided for decades. I treated myself like a priority instead of an afterthought. On the morning I flew out for my first trip, I left a small note on the kitchen counter. "I'll be back. Don't drown while I'm gone." It wasn't a taunt. It was a boundary. I packed my suitcase with the steady heart of someone who had finally learned how to refuse without apology. The door clicked shut behind me. For once, the silence was not heavy with responsibility. It was the hush of rooms that belonged only to me. The first sign that things were shifting came in small, practical ways. Without my auto pays, the mortgage reminders started to stack up at my sister's address. Without the monthly wired checks, Marcus's car slipped into arrears. By the end of the week, the repo notice was real, stamped with that company font that never felt kind. When the tow truck arrived and took the van that had been his pride, his face changed in front of the neighborhood the way a curtain falls, utterly exposing. News travels fast in small pockets of town. Marcus went to the bank to plead and discovered that I had already formalized the change of ownership. The bank teller explained the situation kindly but clearly. If payments aren't made, the lender will repossess. Marcus stood at the glass and realized for the first time in a long time there were no hidden hands to steady him. He called me, and then, realizing I wouldn't answer, stormed to the house with a neighbor in tow. At my sister's house, the landlord sent an eviction notice. It landed on the doormat like a truth. Suddenly there were phone calls to uncle attorneys no one had used since protests in the 80s because this was serious. Cousins who had once shrugged off responsibilities now found their lines cut because my name wasn't paying their bills anymore. They had been living on the illusion of my endurance. When the illusion went, the real shape of their finances emerged like a bruise. Tasha, who had relied on me for designer shoes and emergency wires, found that her credit card had been declined at the boutique she'd always shopped. She stood at the counter with her head down and a pile of clothes she couldn't buy. The shop owner, someone who knew my family, whispered, "You gotta tighten up." And Tasha felt the sharpness of public shame for the first time. She called Marcus and then Bobby, and they all turned to each other without a plan. In the middle of the implosion, an unexpected twist arrived. Cousin Bobby, who'd pressed hardest that night for money, had been skimming funds from a community account he and other cousins used to collect for neighborhood events. When the heat came off me, his little side scheme blew open. Someone at the community center noticed missing cash and raised suspicion. It wasn't dramatic, it was bureaucratic. A ledger, bank withdrawals, mismatched receipts. People who had once dismissed Bobby's bragging now had evidence that he had been living off other people's trust. When confronted, Bobby's defense collapsed into blame. He accused Marcus of reckless spending and Tasha of not returning borrowed clothes. The family structure, long propped up by my willingness to bear the burdens, now looked like a house of cards. Trust unraveled in the very meeting where they had intended to demand more from me. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who had been watching. Word spread through the church and into the barber shops. Neighbors who had once called me the Rock started whispering, "Good for her," and it was about time. Not everyone agreed, of course. Sermon lines about family and forgiveness filled pews. But practical matters don't wait for Sunday sermons. Taxes went unpaid, lights flickered off in houses where my auto pays had kept them steady, and letters with official stamps arrived at addresses that had assumed my intervention was eternal. As the week moved on, creditors that had been patient with my family became less so. The cousin with legal fees missed a court appearance, not because he wasn't told, but because he had presumed someone would always provide. Fines accumulated. Small claims hearings appeared on calendars. In those rooms, the people who once leaned on me had to explain why they had not paid. They had to account for choices that I had previously softened. Watching this unfold was not triumph. It was a detached observation of cause following effect. There were no miracles, no dramatic bank collapses, no sensational arrests, just the slow, grinding reality of people learning that credit has consequences. The neighbor who had relied on me for roof repairs had to face a contractor's unpaid invoice. His work stalled. Children who had once been wrapped in my security felt the cold of being expected to step up too soon. It was painful, messy, and wholly natural. Then came the phone call from a mutual cousin I hadn't heard from in years. She was breathless, terrified. "They're coming for everything," she whispered. "They're turning on Bobby. The community center wants answers. People are angry." The hum of community disapproval can be as devastating as legal penalties. Bobby's charisma dwindled when confronted with financial records. He had to repay money he had spent like a man who had been banking on other people's soft edges. In the midst of that, Marcus tried to rebuild by taking a third-shift job, the kind that chews into your back and gives you little time to think. He was stiff when I saw him at the corner store, and our conversation was small and practical. He had to sign up for a payment plan. He asked me in a low voice if I would help him get started. I told him what I had told him before. I can't. There was no spectacle, just the slow, honest work of consequences. consequences. Meanwhile, I did not gloat. When a neighbor called to say she'd seen my sister standing on the sidewalk with a box of her things, I felt a tightness, but no schadenfreude. I had made a decision that required honesty from people who weren't used to it. I had not set out to break them. I had set out to stop breaking myself for them. The fallout was their responsibility now, not mine. Late one afternoon, the church called. The pastor wanted to meet and asked if I would consider mediation. I considered it. I agreed to a meeting, not to reestablish old patterns, but to set boundaries publicly so the family could see the limits. At the meeting, I sat with my hands folded. People talked about forgiveness and responsibility. When my brother asked for another chance, I offered to help him find local resources, job training, budgeting services, but not money. The room hummed with tension. His face was smaller than it used to be. One more small twist came when a garnishment notice arrived at Bobby's place from a creditor he had ignored for a long time. He had to sell a few belongings, tools, a television to cover a tiny portion of the debt. The community center, which had been his platform, removed him from its committee. The consequences were ordinary but effective. Where there was once entitlement, there was now accountability. People had to make real choices. Through it all, I watched from the quiet of my kitchen, not rejoicing, only breathing. The network of safety they'd relied on had been altered. That kind of change is loud in its silence. I had expected anger from some, relief from others. Mostly I saw people hit by the reality they had been avoiding. It was not pretty. It was necessary. And it was mine to observe from a place of self-care rather than involvement. After a few months of watching things settle into their new, harsher rhythm, the pleas started again, but this time with a different sound. They were less confident, less casual, more urgent. My phone lit up with messages that shifted from bravado to vulnerability. Marcus texted at dawn, "Lore, please, I'm losing my place. Can you help me with a deposit?" Tasha left a voicemail full of apologies and promises. Bobby sent a message that read like an offer. "I'll pay you back, I swear." Their voices had been worn thin by consequence. When they showed up on my porch, one by one, not as a chorus, but as individuals, there was a different energy. Marcus came first, his shoulders smaller. He didn't ask for money the way a man begs a favor. He asked for advice. "How you learn to manage the bills?" he asked, like someone asking for a map. Tasha came with a small bouquet from a grocery store, hands clasped like she was offering me an apology in living color. Bobby arrived last, his charm dulled, carrying a box of mismatched records. They wanted to reconnect, to ask for a thread of my old safety net. When they spoke, I listened. I had learned the power of quiet refusal. I met them with a calm that could have been mistaken for softness, but wasn't. "Bless your heart," I said when Marcus started to plead. It was not scornful, it was final. "I'm done," I said simply, no sermon, no raised voice. They looked at me as if I'd cut a cord they thought eternal. Bobby's mouth opened and closed. Tasha wept, a small leaking of grief for what she'd taken for granted. They asked for promises. I gave them steps. "Meet with the counselor at the job center," I suggested to Marcus. "Start a budget. I'll help you sign up. I won't send money." My actions offered scaffolding rather than a safety net. For Tasha, I found a temp position at a place that paid weekly. She could start right away. For Bobby, I helped him make a schedule to pay back a tiny amount to the community center. The help I offered was not a return to old habits. It was a push toward responsibility. When my sister came to my door in tears, she reached for me like someone grabbing a life preserver. "Please," she sobbed, "we're going to lose everything." I handed her a list of resources and a folder with steps to apply for rental assistance. I didn't open my wallet, I opened a path. She left with her head bowed and then slowly walked back with a pen and a plan. The exchange was ordinary and profound. The neighborhood watched. Some people nodded approvingly. Others shook their heads as if they'd preferred the old arrangement. I didn't care. My calm, my refusal, did more than deny jewelry or bail money. It demanded that people own the consequences of their actions. Does that sound harsh? Maybe, but it was honest, and honesty in families is rare and necessary. I started to fill my days with small, ordinary joys that were mine alone. Coffee on the back porch before the city woke, hands in the garden soil coaxing basil and thyme back to life, a postcard I received from Lisbon, stamped in blue, that smelled faintly of the sea. I learned to savor the quiet of my apartment, the way sunlight hit the floor in a ribbon each morning. I took a pottery class and found that shaping clay with patient hands soothed the parts of me that had been stretched thin by giving. On a Tuesday, I met two women on a small bench near the harbor. They were in their 60s and looked like they had been in many of the same fights as me. Tight smiles, hands marked by years of work, eyes that had known both joy and disappointment. We talked for hours about places we'd been and places we wanted to go. One of them taught me how to make a simple stew she called Sunday's Rest. We swapped recipes with the ease of people making new Sunday dinners out of their own lives, not obligations. A month later, I opened an email notification. My trip to Lisbon was confirmed. I packed with a lightness that felt like song. I didn't buy gifts to take back. I bought small things for myself, a scarf, a little leather journal. When I zipped my suitcase closed, the image that came to me wasn't of leaving them stranded. It was of learning to stand without the weight of everyone else tilting you. They did try to come back, in fits and starts. Marcus sent long, rambling texts that apologized between explanations. Tasha mailed me a cake with a note pinned, "For trying." Bobby left a voicemail that was half regret, half plea. I responded not with a lecture but with logistics, a list of places to get help, an appointment I'd made on their behalf, and then silence. My refusal had become a border that protected the life I was building. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. One morning, sipping coffee on my porch with my passport beside the cup, I watched a neighbor water his lawn. A small child ran past with a paper airplane laughing. The sounds of ordinary life, cars, laughter, a dog barking, folded around me like a quilt. I felt whole in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with being present for myself. The old Lorraine would have answered every call. The new Lorraine answered only those that aligned with her life. The story ends with a small, unperformed gesture. I sit at my kitchen table, a stamped postcard from Lisbon beside me, the handwriting on the back a promise I've made to myself, to tend to small joys, to travel, to keep my hands warm with the steam of my own coffee. I run my fingers along the edge of my passport and close it softly. Outside the window, the city hums, and somewhere, quietly, my family navigates the consequences they've earned. I do not gloat. I do not call them to shame. I keep my door open to the idea of repaired relationships, but not to the habit of perpetual enabling. I take one last sip of coffee, pocket my keys, and step onto the porch where the morning air feels like permission. My face tilts up. The sun is simple and patient. I breathe in, and then, with a small smile that isn't for anyone else but me, I close the door.